The following lecture is from my Udemy course, Complete 3D Animation Masterclass, Create Animated Shorts. If you like my teaching style and are interested in taking your skills from intermediate or beginner to advanced 3D artists, consider enrolling in my course. Link in the bio. All right, so now that we have explored how we can add more geometry to our existing geometry, we're going to take a look at an advanced way we can manipulate geometry called subdivision. So let's go ahead and start by creating a cube here and adding it into our main space. And we're going to go ahead and select it, and we're going to press the 3 key on our keyboard. And what that's going to do is it's going to convert this into smooth mesh preview. All right, so 3 is going to be smooth mesh preview. And what smooth mesh preview does is it applies what we call subdivision. So let's go ahead and press that so you can see the effect this has on the cube. I'm using a cube on purpose because it's the most apparent. And you'll see this is what happens when we press 3. So our cube now becomes a sphere. So let's talk about what happened there. In order to understand what's happening with subdivision, we're going to need to navigate over here to our attribute editor, come in here to our shape tab, and navigate down to the section called smooth mesh. This is where we can modify our smooth mesh preview and we can see what is happening. So let's go ahead and expand that out, and you'll see there's quite a few categories here that we are going to have access to. But the one I'm interested in is this one here, which is display subdivisions. What that will do is it will let us see the additional geometry that has been added through the smoothing process. So if you go ahead and press that, you'll see that this phantom wireframe appears and we have these various dots, and these are the new added geometry from subdivision. So in short, what is subdivision doing? It's adding more geometry and then it's smoothing it over. Now, subdivision is a very powerful process because it is iterative, meaning that we can have more or less subdivision as we need. You'll notice over here we have this preview subdivision levels, and it's currently set to 2. 2 is the default, and what that means is it subdivides it twice. Now, in order to understand subdivision, we can go backwards to 0 levels. You'll see I move back to 1 and back to 0, and you'll see at 0 we're back to a cube. So 0 means no subdivision's been applied, but if we go to 1, we can see how the subdivision process works. Now, taking a look at our cube, the opaque lines, which are these ones, are going to be our source lines. That's our original geometry. Then the dotted lines are our new added geometry that has been added through the subdivision process. So what happens when a surface is subdivided is it's going to take a quad, which is a 4-sided face. So that is a technical term we'll be talking about quite a bit, quad or quads plural. From there, it places a vertice at the center point of the quad, and then it draws a line across and places a vertice at each intersecting edge. Once those vertices are placed, it then creates an edge between them. And once this has been created, it averages the vertices. So what that means is it takes a look at the distance between here and 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 here, and it moves this inward. So our new approximated face turns from a cube to something more like a sphere through this process. So that's what's happening each time we subdivide, is it is adding in that additional geometry, and then it is averaging the vertices. So in short, it gets smoother and smoother and smoother the more subdivisions we have, which allows us to create low poly objects and then be able to create a very high poly looking end result. And we're going to explore that in this section as we learn how to manipulate geometry. But the first thing to do is understand how the base things work. So we've explored initialization. We've now explored subdivision a bit. Let's dive a bit deeper into subdivision and start looking at what happens as we add more and more subdivision levels. So let's go ahead and take a look at this object at 1. You'll notice it's very jaggedy. And if I go ahead and turn on the lights, we can enter something called silhouette mode. When you have no lights, it will just give you a silhouette. Silhouette is another term to understand from this industry. it means shadow, and it's essentially the object in shadow completely, just showing the bulk of the object. And you'll see what we have here is this very sharp surface. It does not look like a cube. Now, if I go ahead and increase the subdivisions to 2, you'll see it looks much more like a sphere now. But if I go into silhouette mode, you'll see it's still not quite smooth. And here's the power of subdivision. Well, do I need to add more geometry? No, because all I have to do is come in here to the preview subdivision level and increase that, and you'll see now it's even smoother. And at this point, you'd have to be pretty close up to not be able to tell that it was not a perfect sphere. But what happens if we go a step higher? At this point, it's indistinguishable in regards to it looking like a sphere. You can see if we go up, at this point, it looks very much like a sphere. And if I were to increase this further, you'll see I'm out of subdivision levels. I could type in 5. You'll see we can go even higher. And now, without question, we have a spherical looking object. And if we throw some anti-aliasing on there, our cube is now a sphere. So you can see the power of that to generate more and more geometry to save us a lot of time. Pros and cons to this, it's not that easy to control. You'll notice that we don't have a cube, right? We wanted a cube and we have a sphere. So there are some factors we need to talk about that allow us to control it. Another thing is you do have to be careful because this is not imaginary geometry. This is real geometry that the computer has to calculate. So if we keep cranking up the preview subdivision levels, we will hit a point where Maya starts to have performance issues because the poly count's too high. Now, there is no magic number for that. That is based solely on your computer. So if you have a more powerful machine, you'll be able to go higher than people with a weaker machine. For some of you, if you're using a really low-end computer, setting this to 5 may actually start to take performance already. So just be aware of that. So those are 2 things to kind of be aware of. The shape isn't one-to-one, right? And performance issues. Some other things to be aware of is how do we go back and forth? If you press 1, 1 is going to go to unsmooth. So 1 is going to be our unsmooth mode. 3 is going to be our smooth mode. And you might be wondering, okay, that's 1 and 3. What about 2? 2 is in between. So what 2 does is it smooths, but it keeps our original cage, the wireframe cage that we are smoothing from. So this could be useful for editing. Personally, I don't work in 2 a whole lot. It's nice to know it's here, but I prefer 3 or 1 when I'm working. So those are some things to be aware of when it comes to subdivision and the smooth preview. Now, let's go ahead and pair this with our previous knowledge, which is using the initialize settings to see how this affects the smooth preview. I'll go ahead and leave it in this mode so we can see both, and I'm going to reduce down the preview divisions to 2 so we don't cause any issues as we increase this in terms of Maya's performance. Let's go ahead and navigate over here to the channel box so we can get to our initialize for the polycube here. We can click into the polycube shape, and what we can do to modify this is we can start to add in subdivision width and subdivision height. The reason why I want to show you this is it's going to help us resolve the issue of this looking like a sphere when in reality we wanted it to look like a cube. So let's go ahead and start by just setting subdivision width to 2. And you'll see the moment we do that, we see a change in our shape. This is no longer looking like a sphere, but it looks a bit more like a marshmallow. If I go ahead and give subdivision height to 2, you'll see now it really looks like a marshmallow. And if I do subdivision depth to 2, you'll see that it looks like a larger marshmallow. But more importantly is it doesn't look like a sphere anymore. We're starting to return to that cube-like state. So what's happening here? Well, we're getting more subdivision. I'm going to hit 1 to exit out of here. And you can see we now have this barrier here and here, which means when things average, they average over a shorter distance. So when we just had a cube, it put that vertice in the center and then averaged around that. So what happened is all the sides got pulled inward, and that resulted in a spherical shape. But if we take a surface like this and we cut it in half like this, the subdivision doesn't occur at the center of just the whole object. It occurs at the center of each of these objects. And what happens is it will average around these. So in short, what we end up seeing is these curved corners, but the middle points hold up because when it averages, it's falling onto the geometry near it, if that makes sense. So in short, having geometry near the edges is going to make this hold its shape. Now, if we increase these further by coming here and setting this to maybe 4 and 4 and 4, you'll see it gets even more cube-like. And if I set this to 8 and 8 and 8, even more cube-like. And you'll see the reason why is the distance is smaller that it's traveling over. Now, I could set this to a dramatic size like 20 by 20 by 20. And you'll see at this point, we're getting something that is like a nice smooth cube. And you'll notice we get these really nice smooth edges along here, which is one of the reasons why we like Smooth Preview. This is one of those things that you see in the real world. And if we wanted to make something like a soft block or ice cube, you'll see that, this is going to be the approach we're going to want to take. Now, this is very messy, though, in terms of geometry. This is not ideal. I'm using this as a start point to show you how this works, but understand that we're going to learn how to control this later with less geometry than what we have here. But it's important to understand how it interacts initially so that when we dive in, we can understand the process of how to control it a bit easier. So just remember what's happening there is it is averaging those vertices. Now, let's go ahead and talk about how this interacts with a couple different types of surfaces inside of 3D. There's 3 types of polygons we're going to be concerned with when we're working inside of 3D due to how subdivision operates. The first one is going to be the one we discussed already, which is called a quad. That is going to be a face that has 4 vertices. So the quad is going to be the golden standard here. It's going to be what we're trying to achieve. And the reason why we use quads is because they work the best with subdivision. Subdivision, as it implies, is a division. It divides, right? So when we think of division, if we divide 4 by 2, we get 2. We get a nice even subdivision. And that's the idea behind using quads. So when it splits, we get that nice even split down the middle with nothing really weird going on. Now, the next thing that we encounter is going to be something called the tri or triangle. And as it implies, it is a triangle. These are okay. The reason why these are okay is every geometric surface you see inside of 3D is technically built out of triangles. So when we think of something like a quad, we see it as a quad for our own usability, but the way the computer sees it is actually as 2 triangles. Now, the reason why it's important to understand this is later on when you get into more advanced workflows or you start working in something like video games, is a quad can be cut multiple ways by the computer, and we don't actually know which way it's cutting it at any time. There are ways we can see it, and there are ways we can edit it, but it could be going either direction. So that's something to be aware of. Subdivision doesn't really care about this because it's going to place something at the center, but just be aware that that is a factor. So important knowledge as a 3D modeler, everything's technically made out of triangles. Triangles are okay. There's nothing wrong with them. But the problem with triangles is 3 divided by 2 doesn't work. So how does subdivision split a triangle? We're going to explore that by taking a look at geometry and looking at the preview to see how it looks. In short, it's going to approach it the same way. It's going to place a vertice at the center, but what we're going to end up with is a bit of a different look because it's going to place the vertices at the different points here, and then it's going to draw lines. Now, this creates something called a pole, which can be problematic at times, and it can cause little pinching or little lifted areas when we are doing advanced levels of shading. So when we add something like a blend or a specular material like a standard surface, we sometimes get these little points that are undesirable in subdivision. Generally speaking, when using triangles, you're going to want to aim to use these on flat surfaces, not curved surfaces. So flat surfaces are going to be okay. Curve, you're going to want to avoid and try and use quads. Now, the final one to talk about is the n-gon, and the n-gon is everything else in terms of polygons. So anything above 4, a pentagon, a hexagon, an octagon, a dodecagon, a hydragon. I don't even know if that's a shape. Anyways, anything that has more than 4 sides is referred to as an n-gon. And these we want to avoid. These cause tools to perform incorrectly. We're going to take a look at some tools like edge loops, for example, take a look at things like bevels, and they can give us unpredictable results. So n-gons are generally something we want to avoid. The other thing is you have to remember they are also built of triangles, but we run into that issue where we don't know how the computer is handling it. There's a lot more ways that it can be constructed than something like a cube. So you don't know if, when you have a shape like this, I'll just draw a couple here to have an example. If the triangulation is going to be something like this, where we have a line running down the center here and then a line down here, or if it's going to be something completely different, like a line here, followed by a line here, followed by a line here, right? So they're very unpredictable in terms of what's going on in the background. And the other thing is they do not smooth well. So let's take a look at some examples here of shapes that contain tris and n-gons so we can see this. If you come up here to the polygon primitives and grab yourself a cylinder, this is one of the perfect offenders of the good old triangle here. So you'll see that when we're working with cylinders, the side here is going to be quads, and this is going to be great for us, very useful. Love it. That's supposed to be a star. And then the top here, you'll see that this is going to be tris. And we haven't tried a tri yet with smooth together, so let's see what happens there. If we press 3, you might be surprised to see what you get. You get this very strange, almost pumpkin-looking thing. And what we're seeing here is the effect of what we call a pole. Now, a pole is where 3 or more edges converge. And generally, the more edges you have attaching to a single pole, the worse off you're going to be. Let's go ahead and explore what this looks like, though, by going into our attribute editor over here, accessing the smooth menu, and turning on the preview. So you'll see something pretty wild is happening here. Let's go ahead and set it down to 1 so we can understand it a little bit better. And let's go ahead and just isolate a single one of these. I'll go ahead and trace around the outside here with magenta so we can understand it a little bit better. We'll see if I can actually get a clean tracing here. All right, so good enough. But you can see what's happening there is it's placing our new vertices. And then what it's trying to do is it's trying to draw quads inside of the triangle. And that is what is challenging, because first off, you have to divide this triangle up, but you're dividing the surface area into quads. So that results in a pretty wonky shape. Now, why is this problematic currently? Well, it's due to the shape of a cylinder. Remember, I mentioned triangles are okay, but you want to have them on a flat surface. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that top surface flat? And you are absolutely correct, but you're also incorrect, because remember, we're averaging. So what happens is this edge here is basically getting averaged from this point all the way down to this point, and that is going to cause an issue. Now, to make a shape maintain its form, we need to add something called holding edges. We can do this with tools like edge loops, which we're going to explore in a later section, but the important thing to understand is what a holding edge is. In Subdivision, if you want something to hold form, you essentially need to have an edge running parallel to it on both sides to make it hold. And that's going to make it so it holds form. So in short, in order to get the cylinder to look like a cylinder, we need some subdivisions this way, and we need some internal rings this way. Now, in the last section, we saw we could do this. So let's navigate over to our channel box. Let's navigate down here into our inputs, and we can give this a height cap of 2. And I'll go ahead and give a subdivision height of 2. And if I press 3 now, you'll see it starts to improve, and we're no longer getting that really wild watermelon shape, but rather we're getting a bit of a barrel shape. And that's because this now has enough hold edges on top. Let's go ahead and increase these substantially, though, here until we get something I might call a holding edge, which is right about here. This should give us a nice soft edge on that cylinder. And we can go ahead and increase the subdivision height. And you'll see we have a nice holding edge here now. So when we press 3, this should maintain the form of something like a cylinder. And you'll see that rounded area now works. You'll notice that we don't even notice the triangles anymore. And this is what I meant about triangles being okay on a flat surface. You'll see at this point, their subdivisions are hardly noticeable. Now, this still could be an issue if this surface wasn't flat or if it needed to deform in some way through animation. But for the purposes we need here, you'll see this works fine. So that's going to be triangles and why you should avoid them. So if you ever need a reminder, go ahead and smooth the cylinder. Let's go ahead and take a look at n-gons now and triangles paired together. Let's go ahead and create a cone here. And the reason why the cone is one of the messiest shapes is you have this radiating triangles here. And then on the bottom, you have a nice big old n-gon. you'll notice there's no triangles drawing this in, so this is an n-gon. So if we go ahead and press 3 on this thing, we're just going to get a mess. You'll see that's going to be what we get, is this really weird teardrop shape. Now, make note of this, though, because if you're going to create something like a seed, well, maybe this would work. But notice some of the really wild things that we're seeing here. So let me put this in silhouette mode so you can see this. You'll see that we have this sharp point here on this area that was flat. What's up with that? Shouldn't that still be flat? And then, of course, we have this really sharp point here with the triangles. Those actually came out okay. So in this instance, it could work. But yeah, we're getting some really weird stuff. So let's take a look at how this is interacting with our subdivision by going over to the attributes and just turning on the display subdivision level. You'll see that with the n-gon, it's placing a vertice at the center, and it's just drawing lines outward to all the accompanying vertices. Now, this is essentially giving us the top part of what we saw with a cylinder. So not really a big surprise there. And then you can see with these, we're getting a similar effect where, since these all converge into a pole, they are holding a sharp form and then pushing outward from there. So in short, this thing is just a complete mess. Now, what can we do about this? Well, we could come in here and we could use the inputs and we could see how we could adjust this. So one of the things we could do is we have this subdivision cap. We could introduce a subdivision here, and you'll see now that's holding that form much better. And just like I did previously, if I increase that out to having a holding edge, we'll get an even better flat result there. But what about the top part? Well, we also have access to do that. We have subdivision height, so I could add these in. And you'll see if I add in enough, we can now get a cone that smooths okay. So that is going to be the base idea there behind utilizing subdivision and how it interacts with geometry. So just to recap, let's go back to our good old cube here. 1 is going to be unsmooth, 2 is going to be smooth with mesh cage, 3 is going to be just smooth by itself. From here, just thinking about how it works, if we have a cube, what happens with a quad face is it draws a vertice at the center point of the face. From there, it draws a vertice down each line, and then it creates a edge between said vertices, like so. And then after that, what it's going to do is it's going to average all the vertices. So what we end up getting, if I can think of this in 3 dimensions, is a much different looking shape where these edges are now getting smooth and being rounded. But the trick is, if we add in holding edges along these edge borders, it smooths over a smaller area, and what we get is a nice beveled looking edge, and we don't get something dramatic and spherical. Okay, so we're going to continue to explore this in depth, but what I want you to do is I want you to explore this. So utilizing the inputs we've explored, what I want you to do is take a cylinder and make it so it can smooth into a cylinder. And then I also want you to take a cube and make it so it can smooth into a cube. So once again, just press that 3 key, come in here to your polygon inputs, or hit the T key if you want to pull up this menu here, and explore how these subdivisions interact with smoothing. Okay, so get familiar with that, and then we're going to take a look at how we can start to control that and build objects with various tools next.